Okay, Sandy, do you want to
All
take
right.
it away?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everybody, and welcome to UVA's Artist Talk series. Tonight, we're excited to have Leah Wilson. Hi, Leah. And I just wanted to say a few words before we begin. I'm Sandy McGee. I'm the gallery director at Umpqua Valley Arts. And hello and welcome to all of our guests and the person coming on right now, Amy. UVA is a nonprofit arts organization who serves our community through arts and cultural events year-round with programs such as exhibitions, artist talks, workshops, and classes, the Summer Arts Festival, and also youth summer camps, and also arts and education, where we bring art lessons into K-5 classroom spaces. Before we begin our introductions and the artist talk with Leah, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral lands of our region. It is with great reverence for these lands and for the history they represent that I read UVA's land acknowledgement statement. UVA Umpqua Valley Arts Association acknowledges, honors, and respects the indigenous people of this region, the Umpqua people, on whose ancestral lands the UVA building now stands. These include the Nahonkudama, Cow Creek Takelma, and the Upper Umpqua peoples, who later became the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and were incorporated into the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The Cow Creek tribal areas include the Cascade and Coast Ranges in southwestern Oregon, along the South Umpqua River and its primary feeder stream, Cow Creek. This tribal area includes the entire Umpqua watershed and surrounding areas. The indigenous peoples of the Umpqua Valley never surrendered lands or resources to the United States, and there are indigenous communities nationwide that are actively fighting for the preservation of sacred lands. UVA gratefully recognizes that the Umpqua Valley is made up of many diverse communities of indigenous peoples who continue to live, work, and thrive in these lands today. We invite you to join us in acknowledging all of the above as our shared responsibility and to consider our roles in healing the wounds of the past so we can continue to build a brighter tomorrow. Thank you. For our program tonight, UVA is proud to present a digital artist talk during these troubled times to give us something educational and uplifting. We are honored to have our artist member, Leah Wilson, here tonight to talk about her work in the show in UVA's Red Door Gallery, Stories Told by Water. Wilson says the show creates an invitation to construct new relationships by listening and taking a closer look at nature. Tonight's agenda, we're gonna go ahead after my introduction. We're gonna introduce Leah. We're gonna turn it over to her. She's gonna give her presentation. But while she's giving her presentation, please feel free if you have questions to put them in the chat. When we get to the Q&A period after Leah's talk, we can take those questions at that time. So what I want to say about Leah Wilson, normally, what's done as an intro is to run down the list of accolades. And Leah has all of these accolades. She has all of them. She graduated with her master's degree in fine arts from the San Francisco Art Institute and has been awarded numerous exhibits, a public art commission, and artist residencies. But what I'd like to emphasize in this introduction is simply how Leah describes what has shaped her and what I feel resonates and has the potential to unite all of us. Leah says, she says, countless miles on the river and trail have shaped me. My decisions and actions are based on time spent interacting with the land and water. With kayaking in particular, to do it well, I need to become a part of the river. Knowing the water intimately blurs the division between me and the water. There is no way to reverse the tacit knowledge of my relationship to the river. It has become part of me. I first met Leah Wilson in 2015, Leah, or 2016. She had some work in a show. And Leah is also a founding member of Gray Space. You can see Kathleen's hat, it says Gray Space on it, along with a group of organ artists, including myself, Kate Alley, Kathleen Caprario, Andy Myers, Michael Boonstra, Vicky Amaros, and Renee Couture. And Leah is just a light in the world with her work. I have been waiting for so long to have this show. She's been just an incredibly hardworking artist who has made work that is so authentic to who she is. And to have this artist talk with Leah tonight is something that I think we've all been looking forward to. Leah's work is so topical and really touches on subjects that are very relevant to today. You know, our questions about the landscape, about what is the present moment and what does that mean for the future? And Leah, we just welcome you. We're so glad you're here, and we're going to turn it over to you, and welcome. Leah,
thank you so much, Sandy. That was really nice. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me a moment here while I switch over here to share the screen. Okay. I believe I am in, so almost. Okay, I'm having some problems. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you for showing up here today on Zoom. I'm pretty tired of it, and so I really appreciate that you're all here. I'm a place-specific visual artist, which means that I respond to and I interact with specific places over a period of time. The place is the foundation of the work. It sets the boundaries, and it often calls the shots. So time and place are my collaborators, not my subjects. All of my projects are created with the purpose of developing a deeper relationship to the place by orienting myself to it physically, as well as embedding it in my memory. So I want to start my story today here because it's really at the root of everything that I make. I became obsessed with rivers at the age of 12 or 13 when my dad took me on a multi-day whitewater rafting trip on the Kern River. I taught myself how to paint by copying photos of that trip, mainly so that I can keep the experience alive and make it feel real in my head. I did not want to let it go. So after that point, I decided that I wanted to be a raft guide when I became 18, and I did that. And I started teaching kayaking in my 20s. And then I pretty much arranged my life around being on the water. And this photo here was taken in Panama when I was guiding a trip in Panama. And I'm gonna just, hold on, admit somebody here. I can't multitask very well, so every time I see somebody in the waiting room, I'm gonna have to pause. I'm sorry about that. And then going back here. So the stories told by water started to take shape over the past year during the pandemic, but it has roots stretching back about 2 decades, or you can really arguably say when I was about 12. So I'm going to take you through a progression of some of my work that leads to my current exhibition at UVA, and then I'll talk about some of the artwork in the show, and then I'll introduce you to what I'm working on in my studio right now. And this is a year of average colors of the South Yuba River, a mathematical determination of an aesthetic value. It emerged from a sense of frustration. I was living in Nevada City, which is a small town in the Sierra Nevada foothills in Northern California. And I was splitting my time between making art, whitewater kayaking, and teaching kayaking. I oriented myself to the land by watersheds. Each watershed has its own personality, so to speak. Nevada City is in the Yuba Bear watershed, and it was due for a 50-year relicensing by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. FERC relicenses all of a watershed's energy projects, most notably the dams, of which there are many in California. The time leading up to relicensing is a bustling time with meetings. All of the different stakeholders hash out a plan and lobby out what's the best outcomes for their own personal interests. Some of which included the power company PG&E, the farming communities that were downriver, the fishing clubs, outdoor recreation, the indigenous Nisenan people. So you can get the point here. There were so many voices that were duking it out, and it was a really messy process to go through. I attended many of these meetings as well as scientific presentations about the river that concentrated on the salmon or lack thereof, since they were not able to breach the dams to reach the South Yuba in Nevada City. And as I listened, I became more agitated. I knew much of the South Yuba River through kayaking. I knew the way that it felt in different seasons and flows. I knew the way the taste of the water changed seasonally, and I knew the voice of the river. The river is a living entity that I loved wholeheartedly, and I didn't hear the voice of the river coming through in the presentations, not even from the outdoor recreation sector where I seemed to most likely fit. Data of any kind does not convey the river's voice. And in contrast, I also attended calling back the salmon ceremonies held by the Nisenan people. The ceremonies were held to build community between the citizens of the area, and also to recognize that the salmon and the entire local community of the plants, animals, and the land, so the entire ecosystem, is a part of our community. The ceremonies are intended to heal the community's sense of loss and to create a space to bring back the missing members of the community. And in this case, that's the salmon. Although Average Colors of the South Yuba River began with cynicism, making it launched me onto a trajectory that's changed the entire course of my artwork. And it really is the project that became the foundation of what I'm doing right now with my art. I took the relentless data gathering of the FERC process, and I used it to create my own data that would not be included in the bureaucratic process. I also took the devotion and the ritual of the calling back the salmon ceremonies, and I infused that into my practice, but that's only become apparent to me in retrospect after many years. For the Average Colors of the South Yuba River, I chose 4 locations on the river that held personal significance. Every month I returned to the same 4 places, and I took a series of underwater photos, which I then sampled to get my data, which is the RGB values of the color of the water. So this photo was taken at the confluence of Spring Creek with the South Yuba. Some of the yellowing comes from the mercury that's still present in the ecosystem from the days of the gold rush and its destructive extraction processes like hydraulic mining, which essentially blasts the hills away with a large high-pressured hose to reach more gold. And this is another underwater photo of the Yuba, so you can see just how much the color differences in the river has in different places. It's pretty amazing. So I sampled all of the photos from each location and number crunched to find the averages of the RGB values for each month. And then I made a single 7x7 inch monochromatic painting of the average colors for each location. Then I averaged each location's RGB values to determine and paint the monthly average color of the entire river. So the monthly averages were ultimately averaged together to determine the average color of the year for each location, and then the average color for the entire stretch of river, which is represented in that lower right panel. So this installation is essentially just an elementary math program or problem that's showing my work to calculate the averages. Data collection was on my mind, but I was not yet aware of the significance of ritual that developed from this process. Time is a fundamental aspect of each project, and to understand the rhythms and the spiraling cyclical nature of it, I must routinely and consistently develop a ritual of being in the land that allows me to develop an embodied relationship with the place over time. I process the experiences sensorially and emotionally, but more importantly, I've collected years of tacit knowledge about these places. So tacit knowledge includes the meaning of a place in a semiotic context, but it also employs memory and imagination, which is essentially the sense of time. The tacit knowledge is a key to transcending the data collection and material experience to bring it to a different plane. It's a plane where art, creativity, and spirituality can coexist. And this, to me, is the plane that we need to inhabit to facilitate true knowing that leads to recovery and relationship. Not only do we need to focus on the recovery of our ecosystems and planet, but we need to simultaneously focus on healing ourselves. In fact, those 2 recoveries are 2 facets of the same entity, and they can't be decoupled. After all, we are nature, and we're of this planet. We're not just on it. So my next project that grew out of the average colors was becoming One Finley. And a friend of mine that I knew from kayaking, Sarah Marshall, and this is Sarah She's siphoning water from a piezometer. Sarah was studying wetland prairies and farm fields of the Willamette Valley and the way that the groundwater flows or becomes blocked in the fields. I followed her through her research sites for a year, and I helped her collect and record her data. Learning about real field research data collection was really helpful, but what was more interesting to me and what really left a strong impression on me is how she talked about the land and her evolving connection to it that developed through her own regular process of data collection. She had established an enduring relationship to these places that seemed similar to what I was trying to achieve with my own art practice. And then once again, I collected my own chromatic data. Becoming One Finley tracks and compares the evolving color palette of two distinct adjacent fields that Sarah was studying in the Finley Wildlife Refuge. That's south of Corvallis. It's in between Eugene, where I live, and Corvallis. The colors they essentially tell the story of the groundwater in the fields as seen by the color changes in the population of the plants. There's a native wetland prairie, and then next to it, there's a farm field that is undergoing restoration to return it to a state that more closely resembles that wetland prairie ecosystem. The land is rented out to a duck hunting club, and as long as that land is rented out to the club, their desire for enduring ponds for the ducks will never allow the prairie to come to full restoration because the native prairies endure months of drought in the summer months, and the enduring ponds in the farm field just won't allow those drought conditions to happen. And with this project, I became more aware of how I could orient myself to the place through time, through the color, the intensity, and the duration of light, as well as the colors of the plants in the ecosystem. I became more in tune to the rhythms and the patterns of chromatic change and how they relate to water. I tracked the cyclical color changes in both of the fields for a year. The colors on the left-hand side of the paintings are the most prevalent colors in the farm fields, and the colors on the right are the most prevalent colors in the wetland prairie. And then each one of the panels represents 1 month. In 2012, I started a long-term relationship with the H.J. Andrews Long-Term Experimental Forest in the Mackenzie watershed. Taking a cue from the long-term research goals of the place, I felt it was necessary that I do the same, and I decided to maintain a relationship with it that lasts my entire lifetime. So it feels almost like a marriage to the forest. And not surprisingly, I started my acquaintance with the place by getting into Lookout Creek to see what I can learn there. It's not exactly a conscious choice to do this when I start a new project, but it's been a pretty obvious pattern that's developed. So starting a project is synonymous to getting into the river for me. I've created many individual projects over my years at the Andrews Forest, but most notably for the ritualistic data collection systems are solstices and equinoxes, and Listening to the Forest, which is a permanent public art installation in the PV Forest Science Center at Oregon State University. And that building had been closed for a long time, but I think it is actually open now. I don't want to say that for sure, but you actually might be able to see this in person if you go over there now, which would be pretty cool. And there's a prototype that I made for this project that is in the exhibition now at UVA. Solstices and equinoxes brought me to a second order stream of Lookout Creek. It's in a stunning, just a stunning gem of old growth stand. It was such a pleasure to be able to sit there for hours and hours and hours on end because it really is gorgeous. This is one of the watersheds that did burn during the holiday farm fire in September. Where I was didn't burn, it burned higher up in the system. When I was there, I set up a system that mirrored ecological research data collection. I did this just to try to remove my own subjective choice making from the creative process and to use whatever the environment provided to me at the time, and that also corresponded with my predetermined system. So doing this invites the environment into the project as a collaborator. I need to have trust in the environment to do this. And oftentimes I'll spend several years on a project and I don't know the patterns that will start to emerge until I actually make the work. So it's a big commitment and the projects unfold slowly and I just need to trust that what does unfold will be interesting. And so far it hasn't let me down, but it's always a challenge to try not to interfere or to manipulate the outcome. And it can really be a big struggle to let go of control. So for solstices and equinoxes, on each of the solstice and equinox from sunrise to sunset, I took photographs in 10-minute intervals of a white rock that I placed in the stream. This is my white rock right here. It's become very important to me. So I took a photograph of that and the creek that's surrounding it, the surrounding creek bed. I gridded the photos to be able to take my color data from the exact same 40 locations throughout the day. And then I painted each color in columns of 40 that correspond to the individual 10-minute intervals. Light and time emerge as main compositional elements, but so does the rest of the forest through the colors of the creek. The story of the major rainstorm that I sat through for the winter solstice emerged through color here in this painting, or it's actually 3 paintings. So what you're looking at comes directly from what I experienced when I sat there from sunrise to sunset. Each of the season's panels follow the same structure. Each one has 3 panels. The first and the third panels represent 3 hours each, and then the middle panel changes width to accommodate the rest of the hours in the day. So the winter solstice here was precisely 9 hours long, and each one of the 3 panels holds 3 hours of time. Then there are the 4 light horizontal bands of color that you can see in this one. Those are the colors that I sampled directly from the white rock. And I did that so I can see the color of the water independent from whatever colors that the creek bed would be contributing. So you can see here that the bands are very distinct from the surrounding colors in the creek on the left-hand panel. So the storm was just starting in the morning, and then it began picking up intensity in the middle of the day. And the bands start to blend in with the rest of the creek in the third panel, and that's because the creek rose with the storm, and then so did the turbidity of the water. It was actually quite hard to see the rock that was sitting at the bottom of the creek by the end of the day. And then there are those light flecks that look like it's static. And those started in about, I don't know, hour 3, and they continue from hour 3 afterwards. Those little flecks are from foam and from bubbles that were created by the increasing water velocity, and their increase corresponds with the increased intensity of the storm. After I finished this project, one of the scientists at the Andrews made graphs of the stream flow and the turbidity over the entire year. And then she highlighted the days that I collected my data for these paintings. And I learned afterwards that this storm was the biggest storm of the year. So it made me feel like a badass for sitting through that storm. It was really hard to sit there, even though it was the shortest day of the year. It just felt like it went on forever because it was so cold and frankly quite miserable to do that. And then you can see throughout the rest of the paintings that the sediment load accumulated through the seasons. It increases as time goes on from spring. This is spring here, where the colors of the rocks are vibrant because there was no sediment accumulation yet. To summer, where they become muted as the water slowed and then the sediment started to sink to the creek bed and then cover the rocks. And you can see here that the scarcity of direct light, you can see just how short of a time period that it actually reached the creek, because the canyon is so narrow there. It's so steep and so narrow that you only get this little window of direct light, and that is seen with those light vertical streaks that are in the middle panel. And fall here, where the creek bed is totally covered in a thick blanket of sediment, and tannins color the water from decomposing leaves. You can see the effect of the tannins in the water with the 4 bands corresponding to the white rock. They have a yellowish brown tinge all the way through them because the water just held so much of that decomposing matter. Listening to the forest brought a new ritual of marking the passage of time in the forest, and also a different way for me to look at the flow of water through the forest. This installation includes 16 62 by 47-inch panels. It's acrylic and bio-based resin on birch. The main compositional elements of each panel are wood anatomy patterns cut out of the panels using a large bed industrial laser cutter. Each panel has 3 layers. The compositions of the panels are the anatomy of 4 tree species. There's red alder, western hemlock, Pacific yew, and Douglas fir from root to crown. The bottom edges of each panel correspond to graphs describing forest data from different forest processes. So there's air temperature, and that's shown at the top panels of the installation. Leaf wetness is the next one down. Then the dendrometer reading, which is the shrinking and the swelling of the tree's boles, and soil temperature. And data correspond to the 5 days surrounding the days that I climbed an old growth Douglas fir tree in the Andrews Forest. I climb the old growth tree named the Discovery Tree each season to see how the forest ecosystem changes, not only through time, but also vertically. I wanted to feel, hear, smell, and see the changes in the environment. So the atmospheric differences that the tree experiences simultaneously with its height. I climbed to about 150 feet, which wasn't the top of the tree, but it was close enough. The experiential knowledge, which is represented by the light and the color in the panels, was a counterpoint to the wood anatomy and data generated aspects of the main composition. The wood anatomy and its rhythms are integral to how the tree moves water from its roots to the crown with its vertical water transport system. But the light and the water help shape the patterns, and their presence can be seen by the arrangement and the differences in the patterns of the anatomy structure in the wood. And this is constructing water. It's also in the exhibition, and this is an ongoing project. I've been building it over time. It took about 2 years to hand cut the 16 layers of Duralar that create the composition. And now I've been working on how to make it structurally sound and portable so I can take it to different locations where rivers and creeks have been constructed and manipulated to fit human needs and desires. So the place is meant to complete the artwork. Constructing water is translucent so that the colors of the location that it's placed in become an integral aspect to experiencing the art. And yeah, I'm going to just leave it at that right now. So the tacit knowledge gained from my ongoing and evolving relationships with the creeks and rivers, more than the information, has guided my choices about how I live my day-to-day life. I choose to ride my bike rather than to drive whenever I can, and I try to consume as little as feasible. But these outward acts seem almost inconsequential in a lot of ways. And less tangible actions, although more abstract, feel more real and reciprocal. My most significant act has been infusing all I've learned and received from the land into my art. It's an act of reverence, and I don't believe that I have a more meaningful gift of reciprocity to give. This drawing was made from a photograph that I took of my white rock used in solstices and equinoxes and some other projects. The rock has become it's like sort of a proxy for myself. And it's also a point of reference when I start a project. So it helps me when I get in the water, it helps me focus. And when I feel overwhelmed by the unknown beginnings of the project, I use that white rock to narrow my choices and to give me an entry point. I chose to use mica powder to delineate the entire Mackenzie watershed. That's the linear branching parts of this drawing. I used mica since mica is prevalent in so many creeks and streams. So a lot of us know mica by its name, fool's gold. It contributes to that sparkly nature in a lot of the creeks and the streams. It seemed like it was an appropriate medium to represent the mapped waterways. I strive to approach my creative process as I do my time on the water, inviting collaboration between the land, myself, and the art. The better I can become integrated with the water, the better I can kayak. And then the same principle holds true for the art. I feel that it's my duty and my act of reciprocity to create the best art I'm able in collaboration with the environment. And so I need to know it as intimately as I can. So this is the first video I have ever made. It was created in the wake of last September's fires as I started to process those events. I wanted to get the footage from the Mackenzie River, but it wasn't accessible at the time because the roads were still closed because of the fires. So the video imagery comes from the North Fork of the Middle Fork of the Willamette River. And I'm going to play this for you now. It is in the exhibition. I view everything I've done up to this point as a prelude to stories told by water. For me, the prelude ended last month when I was at a residency at Pine Meadow Ranch and Sisters. I went there to learn about water use on the eastern side of the Cascades and especially about ranching. And although it's only 2 hours away, I really know very little about the watersheds on the other side of the Cascades. But water defines the place, but in such a different way than from where I live here in the Willamette Valley. I wanted to use my residency to get my toes wet, literally and figuratively speaking, for a project that I've had in my mind for years about the Klamath River and its complicated and extremely contentious politics and history. But as with most projects and residencies, my initial idea of what I thought I'd be doing there became absolutely obsolete almost immediately. It started to grow into something so much more interesting, encompassing, and far-reaching than what I originally imagined it would be. Not knowing what I was going to do, as you now know, I started by getting into Waichus Creek, which is the creek that runs through the ranch. And I started taking photos of my white rock. I started this piece at Pine Meadow Ranch. It's behind me. I don't know if you can see it right now, but I'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. I got into the creek every day, sometimes with my camera, sometimes just to walk up the creek and sometimes to swim. But I was in the creek. I was in the creek every single day, which was great. But the real work I did there was in a different form, one that made me feel really out of my element at first. So much of my time was spent meeting with people and asking them to tell me stories about their relationship with Waichus Creek. I'm an introvert, and meeting with people can feel somewhat intimidating, and it takes a lot of energy. And I didn't feel at all prepared to talk to other people about my project since I had so little understanding of it myself. I'm not sure I would have done it if the people at the residency didn't facilitate this. Actually, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have done it if they didn't facilitate it. And facilitate sounds way too mild. They just totally thrust me into having these conversations by making connections and introductions. And I just had to go along with it. But I'm so grateful to them for doing this because they pushed me over one of my biggest blocks. So this is Louis. He's a heavy equipment operator with a Three Sisters irrigation district. He just happened to be there at the site when Carolyn, who's also in this photo, took me to see the irrigation diversion on Waichus Creek upstream from the ranch. Louis gave us a tour of the water diversion, and he proudly told us stories of the improvements that they've made on the entire irrigation system to ensure that more water stays in the creek. Historically, it had been common thought that if the creek was not completely dry by the end of the summer, that the irrigation district manager wasn't doing his job. Water is a resource to be used, and if every available drop was not used for irrigation, that it was just seen to be wasted. But now there's a real possibility that salmon and steelhead can return to Waichus Creek. And when that happens, as I was told by another person I spoke with, they'll feel like they've been reconnected to the Pacific Northwest, since so much of the Pacific Northwest identity is tied to salmon. And to me, that was just such an incredible statement. I had never really thought of it that way, that they felt they felt separate from the rest of the Pacific Northwest. And doing this and listening to people's stories, I became really interested and invested in how an entire community's ethos and views of a creek can shift over a very short period of time. And I wanted to know more about other people's relationships with their creek rather than just concentrating on my own relationship. And this photo was taken in Waichus Creek. I placed my rock in the creek above a little rapid by my studio, and I let it unfurl in the current. And then I photographed its path. I thought of it as a dangerous line because any rope or line in the river is a hazard when you're boating. And it was a little bit of an internal joke that I had with myself because the creek was so small at this point. I could just walk down the rapid with no problem since the creek really only came up to my calves at most. So there was no danger at all. But as I took these photos, the activity became a metaphor for stories told by water. Each person I spoke with started to shape my project. And I realized by being there and being open to listening to everybody's stories, I was following a line affecting my art. The line is the stories that they told me. So along with Louie, I spoke with Chris, who's the daughter of the previous owner of Pine Meadow Ranch. She told me stories of the diversion dam her brother Doug built on Waichus Creek, where the water was diverted through a canal to the ranch and then into a large pond in the center of the fields. The dam and, well, it was a fish barrier. It was removed several years ago after 5 years of discussions headed by the Deschutes River Conservancy. And as a compromise, the ranch received a water pump and the pivot to irrigate the fields. I showed a photo of the pivot a few frames back. I also spoke with two ranchers who had moved to Sisters in 1959. When I got to their ranch, 92-year-old Roy was out in the fields on his quad with his dog fixing the sprinkler system. The clogged sprinklers are a perennial problem because there's so much sediment in the water. And Louie and the Three Sisters Irrigation District are currently working on their property to pipe the water flowing from the creek to their property. It's one of the few remaining open canals, which is part of the antiquated system that contributed to up to 50% of water loss from the creek due to evaporation and ground absorption. So Roy and Carolyn told me about the flood of 1964. That's the flood that became the catalyst for straightening and confining Waichus Creek and contributed to the relationship people had with the creek and their belief that it needed to be a fully constructed and built system to be able to live there. And over the past 3 decades, that ethos has gradually shifted by the efforts of some of the other people I met with to hear their stories, such as Brad with the Deschutes Land Trust and Marette, who was instrumental with obtaining wild and scenic status for Waichus Creek when she was with the U.S. Forest Service. So this is where I am now in the process. I'm listening to stories. This is also how I will start working with the Klamath River and other watersheds. I'm following that line I placed in the current to see where it leads me. Remaining open is the ongoing work I have to do. Listening to the stories brings me face to face with my own beliefs and biases. My challenge is to be true to the stories, not to my own beliefs. It's related to the work that I did with projects like solstices and equinoxes, where I set up a system and then I followed it. And I can't tell you how hard it was not to tweak my system arbitrarily here and there to include things that I wanted to show in those projects, but that fell outside of the range of my system. Combating my own beliefs and biases is so much harder than doing that. And one of my challenges with Stories Told by Water is to remain open and curious the entire time. And I want everybody to feel respected and heard, even if I vehemently disagree with them, and for this to be reflected in my art and in my writing, rather than taking a position and making didactic art with a more activist bent to it. And because I'm sitting in my studio, we can do a little studio visit and I can show you work in progress. So back to the piece that's behind me, which you still probably can't see because I'm sharing my screen. It's titled Memories of Running Free Like the Wind. And it started with physically being in Waichus Creek as I began to get to know it. This piece began taking shape as I heard stories of Waichus, specifically about water rights. Ideas for projects in general usually don't come together as fast as this one did. I found the metal grid that I'm using for it in the boneyard at the ranch. So the boneyard is where all of the worn out ranch stuff ends up. And then the artist residents can wander through the boneyard and use anything that interests them. Most of what can be found there is just way too big to drag out. The fencing material wasn't something that I actually wanted to take because grids have made their way into so many of my projects, and I wanted to get away from using grids. But each time that I came to the boneyard, I just gravitated towards the grids. So I took them and I brought them into my studio. And the red grid on this image corresponds to each of the grid squares of the fencing. So there are 110 squares in total on this grid. So many of those stories that I heard from people I met with involved the water rights, some of them extending all the way back to 1895. Those water rights supersede the water rights of the irrigation district. Water rights are plotted out on a grid system. And in my studio, I had a binder of the history of the transfer of water rights and property on the ranch. And I just made my way through that binder as I was making my way through just getting to know the place and trying to figure out what I was doing there. As I was looking into the water rights transfers, I found maps of the creek and the canals near the ranch, such as the one here. So the land is gridded and it's mapped to assign who gets what water and how much. And then I made the connection between this map and then the fencing grid. So this water rights map will be woven into the grid behind the drawings that I'm making of the current and the white rocks of the water that I showed you earlier. It's going to provide a human man-made geometric construction of the concept that water can be owned, portioned out, and controlled as a right, as a counterpoint to the organic forms of the ever-changing patterns and the freedom of the water from the photos that I took in the creek. This was my studio at Pine Meadow Ranch. I absolutely loved this place. It was so perfect for me. It was called the tent cabin. And then the creek is just on the other side of the fence. So I can just pop on down there really easily whenever I wanted to. And almost every afternoon, the wind picks up there, and it is just a force to be reckoned with. It was something else. I hate wind too. But the wind blew through the front door of the studio, and then it just blew all the way through the back door. And the first few days before I had things all sussed out when I was working in there, I had to chase down a whole bunch of paper and drawings that would suddenly be just whisked away and fly out the door by the wind. So wind defines so much of my experience there that it also made its way into the piece. I am really just beginning this piece, and so I usually don't share work in progress, but I'm gonna share this with you anyway. This is a video that I took while I was in my studio at the ranch. So you can see that each one of the squares is a section of the image of, maybe you can see, of the patterns of the water that I showed a few frames earlier. It's graphite on Duralar. And each of the 110 squares, the drawings will be tied to the grid up at the top. And then it needs wind to complete the piece. As the wind blows the drawings, the water rights map will be revealed underneath it. And I'll just play this video for you. It's the short one. Okay, and then since the creative process it's creative, it can create a space for recovery and connection. And it can also create a ritual and a process that leads to discovery, and it can create community for recovery and relationship. But creating alone isn't sufficient. It also must be shared. I incorporate my voice into the process through writing and speaking like this, which is a continuation of my time teaching outdoor education for so many years. But this is so much more personal, and thus it's so much more vulnerable. Vulnerability, as uncomfortable as it is the signpost pointing to where it is that I need to travel. Without it, there's no possibility for real connection and empathy to take root, and therefore no substantial reciprocity. But this vulnerability is one of openness and strength, not one of weakness. It's a vulnerability of devotion that leads to creating and healing. It's the path to knowing how to make informed choices guided by relationship that will enable us to take care of the land and to allow it to take care of us. So that's what I have for you today. And here's my ask for you. I'm looking for stories to hear about our watersheds in Oregon, especially on the Klamath. So if you or anyone that you know has any interesting story in relationship to any of our creeks and rivers, then I would love it if you would let me know. You can also follow my process and the stories on Instagram and Facebook. If you really don't want to miss anything, please sign up for my newsletter. The sign up is on my website, leahwilson.com. Thank you so much for being here today and listening to my story. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have now. If something comes to you later, feel free to email me. You can email me through my website. And just give me one moment here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will rejoin you. Okay.
Leah, that was absolutely beautiful. Yay. We'll give you a Zoom clap. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. What a delight to hear your story. I am interested if you have questions, just like Leah said, please put them in the chat so that we can read them out loud. And then Leah can answer those questions. Does anybody have a pressing question?
Okay, that means I probably have to look at chat.
Could be that things are probably being typed. Leah,
I don't think we've got to.
I will start out by asking a question. You know, I saw your piece, Constructing Water at Lane Community College, for the first time. And I want to encourage everybody to come to the Umpqua Valley Arts to see Leah's show if you haven't been able to come here. I know some people have. But this piece, Leah, it really, as you were talking about the data collection and all of the sort of methods you're using to sort of peel back those layers in nature to really take a closer look and a layered look at and a deeper look at what's going on and what that meaning is for you. You, in Constructing Water, also sort of put together the experiential piece. And I think you're doing this with a lot of the works that I just saw, you know, where you have sort of science and data collection sort of converging with that visual matter that you're producing. And now it's taking on so many different layers. But in that piece in particular, there are many, many layers. Can you talk a little bit about just that process of making that work? Like, basically, how long did it take you to make the piece? Like, and just, you know, how you got there. I mean, it's a stunning piece when you look at it, you guys, based on you're in the whitewater like rafting experience that Leah talks about. It's there. And for an artist to take something that's so intimate and something that you've experienced to use like plastics to create this, it's just phenomenal. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that process.
Um, well, how long did it take me? It seems like forever, too long. It took about 2 years to cut everything, and then every time that I show it, it goes through a different iteration, because I'm still trying to figure out how to get it to be freestanding, and how to get it to be able to withstand things like wind or the water, because I want to be able to put it into certain creeks, and who knows what other areas they're gonna end up. But um, I'm trying to think of when I started it, because I know that I started it for specifically to go into gray space. And so that had to do with how I decided the dimensions was, so it would go into our gray space cube, which is a 6 by 6 by 6 foot cube. I haven't actually put it in there yet. So maybe someday it will go where it was intended and then I can wheel that out somewhere. But I have a feeling that this piece is going to be just evolving for, I don't know, decades. It's going to help me tell stories as I bring it into places. So I've got my white rock that's kind of like the proxy for me. And then I see this piece as also being something of a stand-in for me as I get to know other places and other rivers and creeks.
Thank you. There is a question. There's some questions coming in from Leslie. Hi, Leslie. I'm interested in the role of writing and multiple ways of communicating complex data. Can you talk about the connections between the place, the work, and the words?
Leslie, that's a big question. She shrugs. The words, so the writing is something that's a lot more immediate for me. I'll go into the place, and typically when I first started working with the place, as I talked about in my talk, I start with photography because that's also really immediate. The photography and then that white rock, it really does help me focus, so I'm not just so overwhelmed with everything around me and all the things that I can do with it. And I'll keep returning to the same place over and over again. And then I start to write about it, and I start to write about my experiences. And it's through writing that I start to learn what I actually really do think about something, because I usually, I a lot of times I don't know until I start to write. And so since that is a much more immediate process, then I can publish that out almost in real time, where the pieces themselves, when I'm making the visual art pieces, a lot of those will take so many years to create that those are really behind. Um, and then if you follow me on Instagram or on Facebook, or even on, on my blog, you'll see that I'm really not showing a lot of my artwork itself. I show a lot of the photographs. And so for me, the photographs and the writing go hand in hand for the storytelling of the place. And then through that process, then the art emerges. I like to keep my projects open, so I can kind of tweak them, and they evolve as my understanding and my learning evolves with the writing and the photography.
Excellent. Thank you. Amy Gibson has a question. Hi, Amy. Long time no see. Leah, what are some of the most powerful insights you gained by listening to the stories of others? Whatever you found most interesting, not necessarily agreeable or disagreeable. So curious what that was like.
I am still trying to process all of those stories that I heard. I think one of the most powerful insights that I had was that even though I was speaking with people with really diverse interests and experiences and views, the people that I did speak with spoke about a deep relationship that they had with the creek. And even if they were using it in a way that I didn't necessarily agree with, they were trying to do it in a way that was that they saw best. I think, and I think that I can see people's best interests coming through, even though people might not see other people's connection to it and their views with it. Um, I also thought it was really interesting when I did ask about their relationship with the creek, that they had never really thought of it before. A lot of the time, like they had to really sit and think about it. And then some people didn't think that they had a relationship, but they always had an answer. And then I would ask about the relationship that they thought that other people had with the creek, and if people had a relationship with the creek. And the most common answer that I received there was yes, except for the new people. And so they seemed to be really concerned about the people that were just moving in, because they didn't have that connection to the land and to the place. And I feel like, especially with in Sisters and with Waichus, that has been such an incredible success story. And they feel really proud about that. And I think that they're afraid that that is not going to be something that's going to be valued or even known about to the people who are moving in, and the way that the community is going to end up changing. I can also say that one of the things that really struck me was talking to Louis, because Louis is not an environmentalist in any way, shape, or form. He's a heavy equipment operator, and the work that he's been doing on Waichus is something that he's extremely proud of, and he's extremely proud of what they've accomplished with that. And he told me that he wants that story to be known. So he was really happy that we actually wanted to go on a tour and hear his story. So I think I'm going to leave it at that right now, and I'm going to process more. I'll probably write about it.
All right. I'm so sorry, Anita, I skipped your question. We're going to go back to Anita's question. Hi, Anita. I'm interested in hearing more about the inclusion of movement or weather patterns in your work, i.e. the wind activating your WIP. Can you speak to how this works to activate or bring in the viewer? How does this work? How does this work to activate? Oops, it just popped over. How does this work to activate a viewer who maybe doesn't feel invested in the particular location or place to which the piece refers?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Anita. And it's one that I'm only starting to really think about more concretely now because the work that I was doing before was more static. It was more based on more traditional art medium. And so when I'm in a place and I'm experiencing the place, I'm always experiencing change and movement of some sort, whether it is the current or the wind or the light. And so those experiences have become more important to me to bring into the art in a more concrete way, so that I can complete the relationship with the artwork with a place itself. So, with our work in process, I really want that. I want that to be outside if possible, because the wind is such an important element of it, and it really doesn't work for me unless it's blowing in the wind. And then the same thing with constructing water. It's only been shown in galleries so far, but I feel like it's not going to be complete at all until I can bring it into a space and have the color and the light in that place, in that environment, really affecting and activating the work. Um, and then how do I activate the viewer who isn't really invested in the particular place? I think that this is a way that could possibly transcend that connection or the lack of connection to that specific place, because they will have a connection with the movement of the wind and the air and the light and things like that. And so what I'm hoping, if what I would find is to be really successful with my work, is that they can see something and learn about something new about wind, that it shows them, it visualizes wind in a way that they haven't seen before. And then the next time they're out in their own places, they can bring that with them, and that will affect the way that they're really experiencing their own places. And really, to me, that's the important thing to me, is that the viewer doesn't necessarily have to connect with my place, but they can learn something or take something away from the art that I've made, and then they can bring it into their own place and help them see something differently and help them deepen and nurture their own relationship with place.
All right, thank you. Are there any more questions for Leah? Oh, we do. Kathy Wilson just put a question in here. Comment about bringing the viewer to a different location. As I watched the video when you dropped the dye into the water, I immediately thought about the flows into the Cache la Poudre River in the Fort Collins, Colorado this year after the Cameron Peak wildfire last year.
We're seeing all this mud from the burn that's coming into the Cache la Poudre, and in other rivers in this area, because we had some horrendous fires just like you did, and as we drove along that, we could see the difference in the color. So I was, it really brought it home immediately.
Oh, good. Thanks. Thanks. And that's what I'm hoping for, is that, you can take that and you can transfer that to something like the ash that's going to be in the river, or the confluences of two different types of water systems. One might have more sediment for whatever reason than the other one. When I was making that, I was so a while back, I did a really long trip. I think it was like 26-day trip on down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. And in the fall, in late summer and fall, there are a lot of flash floods that happen in the side creeks. So they'll flash, and they bring so much sediment down with them. And then it's so different. Like there's so much. It's a difference in density, really, with that water meeting the water that's in the river. And you can see the collision of these things so starkly in some of these, how the side canyons will then affect the water that's in the main system. And there's something about that that's stuck in my head for so long, and it's something that I've been trying to figure out how to communicate and show a little bit more clearly, because it's just an incredible phenomenon. And then it does happen with the fires and the mudslides and glacial melt that we're having will also do it. So you can see it all over the place.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. I have another question. Leah, you spoke so eloquently just a few minutes ago about the role of vulnerability and curiosity in your work. You know, the idea that work doesn't have to be, you know, armored in any way. It doesn't have to be didactic and telling people anything. I think that's a really important piece to share about. I mean, I think your work is so much an exploration of not only the spaces and the places, but the materials. I mean, you are experimenting with so many different kinds of things. And what talk a little bit more about your role in all of this with vulnerability and curiosity. I think it's really important.
Oh my gosh. So much of the time I just want to just crawl into a cave and hide, because it makes me feel really uncomfortable. So the first vulnerability that I have is just going into a place, because I really don't want to bring my preconceived ideas, notions, experiences into it, even though that's impossible. And I know that I'm carrying all of those with me all of the time. And so much of what I learned did come from such a particular experience in running rivers and everything that goes along with that, all of the philosophy that goes into all of that, and the environmental considerations and things. But if I do that, then everything is it's so narrow if I just go in thinking like that. And so I feel like it's this constant battle to stretch myself open and to let all of that go. And so I can just receive as much as possible. And I really do feel like this is really where my work is rooted, is that constant like stretching open and trying to stay open and trying to receive, and then let it direct me. So that's vulnerability number one. And then vulnerability number two has been coming with writing. And I started to write a lot more this past year in January, and sharing it. I wasn't really sharing my writing before, and sometimes, honestly, like that makes me just feel like puking because it's really scary. And there's something about putting in words that is. It seems like it's a lot more. It's a lot more substantial than when it's just in my head and then, people read it. But what I'm trying to do there with the vulnerability is just allow myself to write what it is that I'm thinking and, feeling at that particular point in time. And so I give myself permission to, maybe tomorrow I change my opinion completely because I've spoken to somebody who's then just like rocked my world and open something else to me that I can change that. But that's also this vulnerability really is allowing other people to influence what I am writing and how I am seeing things. And oh man, yeah. It's so ongoing, and it's so just ever present.
Well, I mean, I think that just connects to how hard it is to be an artist. You have to be in that space to create work in some ways, in order for it to. I mean, we don't always get there, but I think, you're doing it so well. And then I guess I don't see any other questions coming in, but I just have one last thing. I was thinking about your work and just the hope that's inside of your work. I see this idea, between the data collection and the materials you're using, the visual matter you're creating. I see this kind of thread of time and change inside of the work. And there's this kind of innate hope when you think about change, as scary as it is for people and for the world. But I think in your work, it's getting sort of played out in this really beautiful way of creating hope. And I'm projecting that onto you. But is there anything you can say about that?
Yes, I think I could probably start to write a book about that, actually. So there's a lot to say about that. There is a lot of hope in there. That really comes from the fact that I don't think that a lot of the ways that environmentalism has been approached is effective. So I think that so much of it is very fear-based, and there's a lot of reactionary type rhetoric out there. And what that serves to do, and this is also coming into when I said that I don't want to make didactic art. I do have very strong opinions about things, but I don't want that to be infused into my art, because I don't want to create any more division. There's so much division. With all of the division, there's just so much fighting, and I don't see anything really being solved this way. I see us just going around in these horrible circles. I also see that as being, what's happening, and all of this fighting happening on a level that we're not really ready to do yet. We haven't reached that point yet, in my opinion, because we're missing that whole relationship aspect of it. And I think that so much of the way that we still view the environment and our place in it is as something separate from it that can affect the environment either positively or negatively. And so my hope is that we can really work on this relationship and start to view ourselves completely differently, as not being something separate, but being something so completely part of it that we can't be separated from it. And so that's that simultaneous hope of recovery of both the environment and ourselves. There's so much, I think, sickness, I think you can say, in ourselves because of our disconnection that we have to our environment and to our places. And if we can start to recognize that and acknowledge that and heal that, I think that we can start to maybe come together and hear other people's stories and not see other people as being the enemy. And so that's my hope. And that's what, I'm trying to do that for myself. So my artwork is really trying to put all of this into practice for myself, because it's really, really hard to do. And to use myself as an example and a blueprint of what I do have hope for. I don't know if it's going to work, but that's my hope.
You talk so beautifully. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think those are so important, just this conversation to have with each other. And you talk about water as being that restructuring device in some ways, that water can have the power to kind of reshape our relationships, or to what you're saying is your relationship to yourself. And I think those are just really important highlights in what you're talking about. But yeah, the relationship to yourself and your work, always as an artist, it's something that there's always this negotiating and unfolding. The work is never totally done. So Leah, thank you so much for your story, for telling your story, for your artwork. It's just incredibly important that it's out here and that the world can see it. And it's been an absolute pleasure having your show at Umpqua Valley Arts. Everybody, please come and see the show. It's closing on the 20th of August. And Leah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight on our Artist Talk with Leah Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you all being here. It was great to see your faces in the little squares.
Yay. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Leah, what a wonderful talk. Thank you. You're awesome.
Oh, thank you.
And Leah, I think you're still the host, so that's cool. You just take it all the way out.
Yeah, you did awesome.
You did.
So if you were nervous, it didn't show at all. And so
It was-
yay.